My name is Dr. Kate Brannum, and I'm the Program Director for Global Security and International Relations at American Public University System. And I'm very excited to be here today and learn from today's panelists. So let me just start out by introducing them. We have Dr. Anouar Younssi, who is an assistant professor of Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies at Oxford College of Emory University in the US. He holds his BA in English Literature and Linguistics, an MA in English, and a PhD in Comparative Literature. His scholarly work explores the wave of literary innovation in Arabic literatures. His research seeks to consolidate critical works on literary modernity and the avant-garde in their Arabic and Francophone versions. In addition, he has research interests pertaining to discourses in and about Islam in the US, the West, and beyond. And he'll be starting us out. And secondly, we have Dr. Elena Pokalova, who is Department Chair of International Security Studies at the Department and Associate Professor at the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University. She's an expert in security issues with a focus on terrorism, counterterrorism, and ethnic conflict. Dr. Pokalova has a vast record of publications with her articles featured in such journals as Terrorism and Political Violence and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. Today, she'll be talking about her book, Returning Islamist Foreign Fighters, Threats and Challenges to the West. So thank you. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we will get to them after both speakers. Thank you. Please, Dr. Younssi.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the introduction. And I'm excited to be here for the first time in this forum. And I am going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. So let me do that. Okay, so as you know, my talk today is focused on the relationship between Islam and the West, one that has been kind of strained lately due to various factors, which I will be discussing. So I'd like to depart from a very recent development in France. A few months ago, President Emmanuel Macron talked about Islam, in which he described the religion as being in crisis all over the world today. And he adds that Muslims in France live in a state of, quote unquote, separatism, which he later tried to correct and say that he meant Islamist separatism rather than Muslim separatism. But regardless, there was a very strong reaction to these comments on the part of President Macron all over the Muslim world. And the strongest came from Turkish President Erdogan, which is not a surprise. So there was like a very big outrage, and there were calls to boycott French products in several Muslim majority countries. And there were also protests in various places against these remarks by Macron. Also, in his speech, Macron proposed a new law in France whose goal is to defend the French Republic and its values, and to ensure that it respects the promise of equality and emancipation, end quote. This new law would include numerous measures, and it seems that it's targeted against or at France's significant Muslim population, a group that Macron sees as largely not espousing France's brand of secularity, that is laïcité in French. Interestingly, some update on this proposed bill, which is titled Supporting Respect for the Principles of the Republic, just passed the chamber in France and is set to go to the Senate by the end of this month. Although many observers think that the passage of this bill is guaranteed. And so I want to add some more context to this tension between, let's say, the French political elites and the Muslim population in France and beyond. It's no surprise that France has had a tumultuous relationship with its Muslim population throughout the last 2 decades of the 21st century. And this relationship has even been more exacerbated by recent terror attacks by Islamists, by jihadists. And the most deadly of those attacks happened in 2015. As we all remember, what happened in Charlie Hebdo magazine, where 12 people were killed. And also that very year of 2015 witnessed another horrific attack in different places in Paris that left more than or 130 people dead and hundreds wounded. And so this, the issue of terrorism and Islamist terrorism definitely is a subtext in this strained relationship between France and its Muslim population and Islam in general. And the terror attacks played a significant role in shaping the political discourse in France and elsewhere vis-a-vis Islam and Muslims. And one interesting dimension of this strained relationship is the hijab, or le foulard, the issue about the Islamic veil worn by women emerged as a very contentious issue and occupied the spotlight. And to give some more background to this controversy over the hijab, it actually first started in late 80s, I believe in 1989, with a few, with I guess 3 middle school Muslim students who were wearing the headscarf and were prevented from entering the school in 1989. But then at the turn of the century, in 2004, there was actually a law passed in France banning the wearing of the hijab in public schools. The law was passed. Another similar law in 2010 prohibiting the wearing of the niqab. The niqab is the face and the head covering. That law was passed. And a few years ago, in summer 2016, there were several so-called anti-burkini decrees that attempted to ban the wearing of the burkini. And the burkini is a term that combines 2 words, the burqa and the bikini. And so those are swimsuits that cover the whole body, and they are worn by Muslim women. There was even an incident on a beach in Nice, France, in which French police tried to strip a Muslim woman of her clothing in public, which kind of raised outrage. So with this in mind, it seems like there's a lot of talk about Islam versus Europe versus the West, and talk about some kind of inherent incompatibility between Islamic values on the one hand and European/Western values on the other. And President Macron's pronouncement, in addition to these laws related to Muslim attire, actually are pieces of a larger dynamic and a larger issue with regard to this idea of a supposed threat that Islam poses to Europe and to the West. And I see this as part of a larger spatial, temporal, and ideological context in which Islam and Muslims are increasingly portrayed or perceived as a threat to the idea of Western civilizations, and also seen and perceived as being others and outsiders with regard to Europe and the West. And I should also mention that this kind of suspicion of Islam and its adherents on the part of Europeans is not new, but has precedent in history, goes all the way back to the first centuries of Islam, to the Crusades, to the Spanish Inquisition, and to the European colonial enterprise of the last few centuries, which ended in the latter half of the 20th century. But we still live in a legacy of that. And the repercussions of that legacy are still with us today. To give some more specifics with regard to this historical background, and I would like to zoom in on Algeria here. Algeria, which was seen as a very important place for the French Empire. And Algeria was considered an extension of France. And the Algeria, which was conquered in 1830, was a place where this kind of animosity between France, Europe on the one hand, and Algeria, the Arab world, the Muslim world on the other, was quite prominent. And there was also a battle at the level of culture back then. And there were measures taken by the French colonial administration in Algeria to try to eradicate any semblance of an Algerian national identity marked by Muslim religious and cultural norms. And it was clear to the French then that Islam was clearly identified as a potent adversarial cultural force that had to be subdued. And what's interesting here is that the veil also, the Islamic veil, was identified back then as an important dimension of this cultural identity that needed to be fought and resisted by the colonial administration. And here I would like to quote the well-known post-colonial critic, Frantz Fanon, who writes in his 3 essays about Algeria, and I quote, he says, with regard to the French, if we want to destroy the structure of Algerian society, its capacity for resistance, we must first of all conquer the women. We must go and find them behind the veil where they hide themselves and in the houses where the men keep them out of sight. In addition to the colonial enterprise, I also would like to highlight another important historical fact with regard to the Orientalist knowledge production and the Orientalist tradition, the European Orientalist tradition of the 18th through the 20th centuries, which also played a key role and in many ways aided and facilitated the colonial project. And it's no surprise that the French colonial administration deployed very Orientalist discourse that, intentionally or not, painted Algerians, and by extension Arabs and Muslims, as backward and culturally inferior. And that was important in order to expand and to aid the expansionist and colonialist agenda of France and the French Empire. And so this Orientalist discourse was strategically invoked to justify the colonial project and its maintenance. The Islamic veil was also highlighted and was consistently depicted as a symbol of oppression wielded against Algerian women, and by extension, Muslim women. And also it was seen as kind of force by the men to control women and women's bodies back then. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's all wrong. but I'm just highlighting the discursive entanglements of the Orientalist discourse with the colonialist agenda, and how that helps to clarify and explain some of the current animosities, let's say, between the Muslim world and Europe, the West. Talking about Orientalism, we cannot not mention Edward Said, whose seminal book, Orientalism, of 1978, was an important contribution that challenged this tradition in a very systematic and compelling way. And Edward Said, who was of Palestinian background, and was also an American citizen, and he taught at Columbia University, would also later produce other important volumes on this topic, especially covering Islam and culture and imperialism. But I should also know that Said was himself of a Christian background, not Muslim background. So in the 2003 introduction to Orientalism, Said writes in the introduction, and this is a very important quote, which shows and highlight the entanglements between the Orientalist discourse and policy on the ground, and the damage that this knowledge production could have on the lives of people, and also on the world and the world order. Said writes, I quote, "Orientalism is very much a book tied to the tumultuous dynamics of contemporary history. I emphasize in it accordingly that neither the term Orient nor the concept of the West has any ontological stability, that these supreme fictions lend themselves easily to manipulation, and the organization of collective passion has never been more evident than in our time, when the mobilizations of fear, hatred, disgust, and resurgent self-pride and arrogance are very large-scale enterprises." And I should note that these words were written during the onset of the US and Britain's joint military offensive against Iraq in 2003, which would then develop into a full-fledged war and an invasion. Now, moving to the late 20th century and the early 21st century, and the renewed antagonism in stark ways. And here, I want to highlight some important events that unfolded in the last 20 years or so, which has even made things even worse. And here we talk about, in the turn of the century, the terrorist attacks of 2001 in the US, which were followed by the American invasion of Afghanistan, then of Iraq in 2003, and more importantly, I guess, the rise of the Islamist terror group, jihadist group ISIS in 2014, and the atrocities that it committed in various Western places, in addition to various Muslim locales as well. So the emergence of ISIS, also called ISIL, or just IS, Islamic State, and its successful propaganda campaign to recruit young Muslims from various Western countries who would either join the terror group in Syria and Iraq, or commit terrorist attacks at home in Europe, particularly, but also in North America. This raised alarm about the supposed threat that Islam and Muslims pose to Europe and Western civilization. As you might know, ISIS left so much chaos in various places, including in the Middle East and also in Europe. And the attacks, the terror attacks of 2015 in Paris, France, those were also outcomes and related to this, to the rise of ISIS. And linked to this is another important development, which is the refugee crisis and the migrant crisis of 2015 onwards, in which an unprecedented number of refugees, mostly Muslim refugees, descended on Europe in millions. That was seen as quite threatening. And with the Brexit, that was seen as a threat to the very existence of the EU body, the European Union. So that's important development as well in the 21st century, the ISIS and the migrant crisis. And these developments have led to the rise in Europe and the West in general of right-wing rhetoric and right-wing political parties in various places, from France to Germany to Spain to Hungary to Italy, etc. And even including the US with the rise of Trump and his explicitly anti-Muslim rhetoric. And let's not forget the Muslim ban, which was upheld by the US Supreme Court, prohibiting the entry to the US to people from majority Muslim countries, 6 or 7 of them. So the rise of the right-wing political parties is a very curious and also very worrisome development, because it's, according to many observers, this right-wing discourse is now entering the mainstream politics and national conversation in many parts of Europe and the West more broadly. And here I would like to quote historian Callis in this respect. He says, in an atmosphere of growing and protracted moral panic, parties of the radical right have led a chorus of hostility to Islam as the unifying theme that drew together fears of invasion, oppression, and colonization by immigrant Muslims on the one hand, and the specter of an all-out global civilizational Armageddon that casts into doubt the very survival of the West. Quite an important quote. And what we glean from it is this idea of hostility to Islam as the unifying theme among these various right-wing political parties. Whether we're speaking about the National Rally in France, or Vox in Spain, or the Alternative for Germany in Germany, or elsewhere. It seems like Islam has emerged as the boogeyman. And this is linked to a growing identity politics in Europe because of this supposed perceived threat that Islam and Muslims and Muslim immigrants and the Islamist terrorism. Now there is the question about cultural values is becoming more prominent, more mainstream, and that kind of goes against the idea of a multicultural society. It seems like multiculturalism, which was seen as an important pillar of liberal democracies, is kind of receding, and in face of this growing force of identity politics and taking culture as and civilization as keystones of this new discourse. And I should also say that the rise of identity politics in Europe is also paralleled by another a rise of identity politics in the Muslim world itself. And as I will discuss, the Islamic veil would emerge as an important kind of weapon in this rise in identity politics in the Muslim world, especially by reactionary forces, Islamist and Salafi forces, who look at the veil as this explicit weapon to fight and to resist the West's cultural hegemony. And so it seems like there is identity politics growing on both sides. And both sides are kind of hardening. And I'm talking here about maybe the more extreme on both sides. When I talk about the Muslim world, I specifically refer to Islamist forces and jihadists in particular, and to some extent, conservative Islam as a whole. With regard to the West, Europe, I see this rise of identity politics more of a cornerstone in the right-wing politics and political parties. And so this debate about the Islamic veil in Europe and the West is at the heart of this, which I would discuss later, kind of historical incongruity and this historical maybe misunderstanding and kind of refusal to concede to certain things, to certain apparent things, in order to gain certain ideological gains. And I will talk more about that later. And also, with regard to the Islamic veil and identity politics in the Muslim world, I wanted also to note that the reactionary forces, especially Islamist and jihadist forces, they tend to receive more media attention and they make a lot of noise. And that's, I see, as another hurdle that stands in the way of a true conversation. And it also kind of puts the moderate voices at the background, not at the foreground, focusing on the negative rather than on the positive aspects. And that's another hurdle, another procedural, situational hurdle. So with all this intro that I laid out, there is a key question that I pose in this paper and in this talk, is whether Islam and Muslims in fact pose a cultural and civilizational threat to the West, real or imagined. And so here is my argument in this and my intervention here. While I concede that modern interpretations of Islam, namely jihadism and various strands of Islamism, these modern interpretations of Islam do pose a concrete threat, not only to the stability of Western countries, but also to Muslim majority countries as well. So with this concession, I want to highlight that the Islamic tradition, taken as a holistic entity, is not inherently hostile to the idea of the West, real or imagined, and its putative values of rationality, religious liberty, secularism, pluralism, and democracy. In other words, Islam is not necessarily incompatible with the precepts of modernity, a concept that is generally viewed as a European or Western product. In this project, I quote two names, two important thinkers, the Algerian Muhammad Argoun and the Mustafa Aykul from Turkey, who both talk about a historical incongruity in other words, the Muslim world has yet to catch up with regard to, he said, to the Enlightenment moment. That Europe has taken a route where Christianity was dominant force, and later on, the grip that the Christian clergy had on European society eventually dissipated, and the scientific mind would later wrest this legitimacy from the Christian mind, and science would become the arbiter of regulating people's everyday life. Muhammad Argun says that because of the weakness of the social and humanistic sciences in the Muslim world, Muslims haven't yet studied, scientifically speaking and objectively speaking, the Islamic heritage, and therefore are not capable, haven't been capable to bypass that in order to move to another epoch of history and embrace modernity, not just at the superficial material level, but also at the level of thinking, at the level of mindset. And that this doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, but that there is a historical asymmetry when we talk about the Muslim world and the West, which entails that doesn't mean they are inherently incompatible with regard to the values and the idea of modernity. Mustafa Aikul talks about the crisis, that there is a crisis, and he does agree to some extent with French President Macron that there is a crisis in the Muslim world today, and he says that this crisis can be resolved once certain historical phenomena and historical outcomes have been achieved. I know that I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just gonna say a few things quickly about Argun when he talks about this idea of asymmetry, historical asymmetry between the West and the Muslim world, and he goes back to Islamic history. And he said that there is a precedent in Islamic history with regard to scientific activity, with regard to the medievalist Mu'tazila doctrine, and the era of the so-called Golden Age of Islam, in which philosophical thought and scientific thought reigned supreme, and that there is hope that we can revive that Golden Age of Islam that in the Middle Ages, when Islamic knowledge in various realms, whether in algebra or physics or medicine and philosophy was quite prominent. And I also highlight that there was a great deal of contacts and engagements between Muslim scholars and philosophers and the Greek thought and Greek philosophy. And it was thanks to many of the Muslim philosophers that the works of Aristotle, for example, were maintained and preserved. And Argun talks about the French sociologist Olivier Carré, who also has this view that there is a grand tradition in Islam that values knowledge and science, and also values the idea of secularity, separating religion and state and public affairs. So anyways, so to conclude, I have a few thoughts to say here. The first one is that today there is a general ideological climate characterized by a particular way of understanding the Islamic heritage. In large part, this is due to certain jurisprudential doctrines, such as the influence of Hanbalism, which is kind of a hardcore, very rigid conservative interpretation of Islam that still dominates in many parts of the Muslim world, especially in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And the influence of that is still ongoing. Second point, the rise of Islamism and Jihadism. And finally, the third point is in the post-colonial era, there was an emergence of extremely corrupt authoritarian regimes that were actually supported by Western countries. And this kind of complicity between these authoritarian governments and Western governments was seen as also hurting this cause of true liberation and true espousal of modern ideas, etc. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation. And I'm going to throw it right away over to Dr. Pokalova, and we'll have time for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you to the Middle East Dialogue and the conference organizers for putting this forum together. For the record, I have to say that today I share my own views, and these views do not represent the views of the US government, the National Defense University, or the Department of Defense. I also like it very much how the organizers put us together on one panel, because as my colleague was saying, a lot of these issues actually feed into the radicalization of Islamists. So in a way, we have a vicious circle here, because in France, the movement started in response to the murder of Samuel Paty by a radicalized Islamist. And identity politics, on the other hand, definitely feeds into the radicalization patterns. Further, we have reciprocal radicalization. So far-right individuals radicalize in response to Islamist radicals, and Islamist radicals continue to further radicalize in response to far-right radicals. So definitely a lot of interconnected movements, and unfortunately, the identity politics that Anouar has identified definitely are connected to some of the things that I will talk about here today. What I will share with you are some of the insights on foreign fighter returnees and foreign fighter repatriates that are mainly drawn from my recent book, Returning Islamist Foreign Fighters, Threats and Challenges to the West. Now, my observations are about Islamist foreign fighters. Some of them are true for foreign fighters of other ideological orientations, but not necessarily. And specifically in this work, I focus on the Western countries, and some of the dynamics, again, would be similar to non-Western countries, but some of the dynamics are very different. And again, a lot of it is very context specific. Unfortunately, radicalization is very diverse. And as we see, even in the US, there's multiple routes of radicalization. So it's always very diverse, very local, and very context specific. If you look at Islamist terrorist attacks in Western countries prior to 2010, very few of them were orchestrated by foreign fighter returnees. Actually, mostly were committed by either domestic extremists or relocators, like in the case of September 11th, in which case people arrived in the US specifically with the purpose to commit terrorist attacks. Now, with the rise of ISIS, the situation has changed drastically. And specifically with the involvement of Western powers and the US-led coalition in Syria and Iraq, the then ISIS spokesman Abu Muhammad al-Adnani called on followers to carry out terrorist attacks against Westerners, wherever such attacks could be carried out. And unfortunately, such threats were not just empty threats, because starting in 2014, we experienced a wave of terrorist attacks successfully directed by ISIS and ISIS returnees on Western soil. So specifically, we had an attack at the Jewish Museum in Brussels in May 2014, the August 2015 attack on a train in France, the infamous terrorist attacks in Paris of November 2015 that, again, Anouar talked about already, and the March 2016 bombings at the Brussels airport. Those were the attacks that sort of woke up Europe to the renewed threat of Islamist terrorism. And while initially some of these attacks looked like lone wolf acts, investigations soon revealed that all of these attacks were in fact orchestrated by ISIS and commanded by foreign fighter returnees. So in all these cases, ISIS successfully used individuals from Western Europe, sent them back to their home countries with the explicit purpose to orchestrate terrorist attacks. In these cases, ISIS deployed its infamous Emory unit, and this was the unit that was specifically staged to look at attacks abroad. These attacks led security services to the figure of Belgian Abdelhamid Abaoud, who at that point headed the Emory unit, and he handpicked foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq to send them back to Europe to attack. So naturally, such attacks and the fear of similar attacks in the future caused fears among security services, among different Western agencies about what would happen with foreign fighter returnees, and are foreign fighter returnees dangerous, and would they always strike against their home countries? Back in 2017, for example, Interpol circulated a list of individuals who were alleged ISIS trainees who were on the way back home to their countries of origin. And Interpol alluded that these were the individuals tasked with carrying out potential terrorist attacks in the future. So clearly, Western security services raised alarms about foreign fighters who could have returned early on and currently might be sort of laying low until further orders from ISIS to attack. Such concerns were further amplified by the fact that prior to the rise of ISIS, many Western security services did not pay much attention to the foreign fighting phenomenon. Foreign fighting itself was rarely considered a crime, which meant that the fact that an individual traveled to Syria and Iraq, to the conflict zone, and came back, that within itself did not constitute a prosecutable offense. As a result, a number of Western governments attempted to actually even eliminate potential threats from any returnees by eliminating foreign fighters themselves. Now, this was not, in most cases, an official approach, but such countries as the US, UK, Australia, and France all favored the so-called shoot to kill approach, in which these Western countries would closely cooperate together in terms of intelligence sharing and would basically target their foreign fighters on the ground in Syria and Iraq. A number of militants from Western countries have been eliminated through such approach, specifically in the US drone strikes. So for example, a British foreign fighter, Mohammed Emwazi, who was known better as Jihadi John, he was killed in the US drone attack in November 2015. Another individual, Sally Jones, a British ISIS recruiter, was killed by a US drone strike in June 2017. So some countries attempted to prevent any kind of future security threats by eliminating their citizens on the ground in Syria and Iraq. But the situation shifted a bit once many Western countries criminalized foreign fighting through measures adopted in response to the 2014 UN Security Council Resolution 2178. This resolution called on member states to develop and implement appropriate criminal strategies to prosecute and penalize foreign fighters. So this was the Security Council resolution that called on Western and non-Western countries as well, all the UN member states, to deal with the phenomenon of foreign fighting, to deal with the roots of foreign fighting, to deal with radicalization, etc. As a result, in response to the resolution 2178, a lot of countries introduced new measures to deal with the prevention of travel of foreign fighters, to deal with potential prosecution of foreign fighters, and to deal with the potential security threats coming from foreign fighters. And now, immediately, I would like to state also that not all foreign fighter returnees pose security threats, and I will allude to that in a bit as well. But in order to deal with any potential security threats that might come from this issue, several countries introduced new measures, including criminalization of traveling specifically to Syria and Iraq. For example, in June 2015, Germany amended its criminal code criminalizing traveling outside the country with an intent to commit serious violent acts against the state. So many of the German foreign fighters immediately fell into these provisions. Similarly, many European countries also introduced similar provisions that criminalized fighting or even traveling outside of the origin country with the intent to commit serious violent acts. However, immediately you can think about what it means for prosecution, because showing intent is problematic, and showing intent to travel somewhere with the potential intent to commit violent crimes is even more problematic. Some countries adopted more restrictive legislation that criminalized travel to conflict theaters where terrorist groups were present. So among such countries were France, Australia, or Denmark. And in these cases, you could face criminal charges if you travel to Syria and Iraq without government approval. So just because Syria and Iraq had the presence of terrorist groups operating on their soil, it became a criminal act, potentially a criminal act, to just travel there without the permission of the government authorities. On the home front, criminalization of foreign fighting reduced the numbers of outgoing Western foreign fighters. But clearly, these measures came after the first waves of foreign fighters. And basically, while it reduced the numbers, it didn't reduce the numbers of potential foreign fighter returnees. And so the issue of returnees still remains. In terms of returning foreign fighters, the biggest issue is prosecuting foreign fighters. Here you have the issue of evidence. How do you collect evidence for people who were on the ground in Syria and Iraq? And immediately, a lot of people who volunteered in the conflicts claim that they volunteered for humanitarian purposes, and quite a few people did. However, the problematic here is how to prove the nature of their actions, how to prove what they were doing, and what kind of evidence you can use. For instance, using military intelligence remains problematic for various reasons, including security reasons. And some European courts have admitted evidence from social media. However, again, such evidence remains problematic because establishing the authenticity of such evidence is not always possible. Some Western countries have attempted to deal with the challenge of returnees by actually revoking their citizenship. And this has been a highly debated topic. Some countries like France allow citizenship revocation in cases of naturalized dual citizens. In other countries, such as Denmark and Australia, for example, dual citizens can have their citizenship revoked regardless of the place of birth. For example, ISIS recruiter Neil Prakash, a former rapper from Melbourne, lost his Australian citizenship since the authorities believed that he also held citizenship in Fiji, and this caused quite a bit of diplomatic friction. Some of the most controversial measures regarding citizenship have been implemented in the UK, where you can lose your UK citizenship if the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds to believe that the person is able to become a national of another country outside of the UK. And this provision was recently exercised in the very controversial and highly debated case of Shamima Begum, who was recently stripped of her UK citizenship Further, she was not allowed to return back to the UK to appeal her case. And basically, very recently, the Supreme Court ruled that while Begum had the right to challenge the case, she should do so from outside Britain due to security concerns. And this case illustrates the potential other issues because today there are still hundreds of ISIS foreign fighters and their family members who are held in the Kurdish-controlled detention facilities in Syria and Iraq. So with their fate being uncertain, there remain a lot of questions of where do these people end up, what is their fate, and how do we prevent future radicalization of these individuals, and also the children who might have been born in Syria and Iraq or are still held in these detention facilities or who are being born in the detention facilities. There is a lot of opposition to repatriation of foreign fighters back to home countries, despite some countries like the US calling on others to take their citizens back. For instance, in August 2020, the US vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that aimed to address the fate of foreign fighters remaining in Syria and Iraq on the grounds that the draft did not include a call to repatriate foreign fighters to their countries of origin. Now, in turn, the US itself and the US Department of Justice issued a statement on October 1st, 2020, saying that the government had repatriated all the remaining 27 Americans from Syria and Iraq. However, the initiative to repatriate remains sporadic, and there is a lot of resistance in other countries. For example, in Norway, in January 2020, the coalition government collapsed over the issue of repatriating a woman and her children. And in that case, the woman was suspected of being affiliated with ISIS. So this issue basically led to the collapse of the government over the question of repatriation. Speaking of women, this is a separate set of challenges that governments are facing. Now, the first challenge is, what do you do with women who are actually victims? Because yes, there are a lot of women who were forced to go to Syria and Iraq by their male relatives, or they had to follow their male relatives to Syria and Iraq in order to remain with their children. So a lot of women do remain victims in this case. However, we also should not discard women who went on their own free will and who actually willingly trained with ISIS and prepared to stage attacks and to participate in violence that ISIS engaged in. A large number of women went to Syria knowingly in support of ISIS. Some women trained in military tactics before actually departing for Syria and Iraq. And a lot of women served in the brutal all-female morality police unit, the infamous Al-Khansa Brigade. ISIS, in turn, actively focused on women to prepare them for future terrorist attacks and even trained women for combat roles in order to overcome the limitations associated with men. And the interesting thing here is that for jihadist terrorist groups, the use of women in active roles still remains very marginal. Now, some of them, like Chechen terrorist groups, have used women in active roles, specifically in adaptations for their strategic purposes. And the Black Widows, Chechen suicide bombers, they sort of became the symbol of Chechen resistance, and they produced the image of female suicide bombers, and a number of other groups such as Hamas, although unwillingly, tried to emulate their examples and also deploy women in the role of suicide bombers. However, these active roles still remain marginal. Al-Qaeda, for example, has specifically claimed that they do not use women, and they have tried to discourage women from combat roles. The more traditional jihadist view is that women should take care of men, should prepare future generations of mujahideen, but should stay at home and take care of the home affairs, not engaging in active combat affairs because that's the domain of men. But with ISIS, we do see that because of the security situation and less focus of security services on women, ISIS has started exploiting this loophole and training women for active roles. And we've already seen some evidence of the use of women in Mosul, for example, or in Libya. We have seen that ISIS cells do use women in active combat roles. Now, despite these factors, female returnees often get more lenient treatment at home, back in their home countries. They often can put the blame on their husbands or male relatives, which again, in certain cases, this is the case, but not always. And female returnees tend to get shorter sentences. Clearly, this is associated with the fact that a lot of the women stayed at home, but the question is in what roles and how supportive they were of the ISIS ideology, and further, how supportive they are of raising their children, indoctrinating them in the ISIS ideology. The second biggest challenge in prosecuting women or in dealing with female returnees is the lack of evidence. So if it is difficult enough to prosecute male returnees, in cases of women, we just do not have a lot of information on where they were, who they were because of the face coverings and the Islamic garments and what they did. So those are the remaining challenges in terms of women. And even further, there's a lot of challenges that are associated with the return of children. There seems to be international consensus that children who were brought to Syria in Iraq or were born there are the victims of ISIS and the group and their parents. However, also ISIS trained children to become the next generation of mujahideen. And there was the infamous Cubs of the Caliphate unit that specifically indoctrinated children as young as 4 years of age. And infamously, one of the British children, he was 4 years of age when he was filmed in an execution video. And children as young as 4, 5, 6 were trained by ISIS as combatants and suicide bombers. So clearly with children, there's a lot of trauma and they require a lot of special assistance in transitioning to life without violence. And they also face a lot of stigma at home. They need assistance to overcome the stigma. They need assistance in medical health, in mental health, et cetera, et cetera. However, just like with adults, a lot of countries are reluctant to bring the children back. Now, some countries like France have attempted to bring children back. For instance, the authorities repatriated 28 children in March 2019 and 10 children in June 2020. But other countries have refused to take children back. For instance, Canada is one of the countries that claims it would be too dangerous for Canadian officials to assist with the repatriation of children. Although in a recent case, a 5-year-old orphaned girl was allowed to reunite with her uncle in Canada. So there are case-by-case situations, but a lot of countries are reluctant to implement a concerted strategy towards their citizens still remaining in Syria and Iraq. Now, my argument is that if Western countries fail to repatriate their citizens, we are creating a lot of problems. First of all, we are misplacing the responsibility, because if we have Syria and Iraq deal with the consequences of radicalization that occurred on Western soil, we're tasking them with dealing the problems that occur at home in our countries. By not repatriating, we're risking to create a new generation of relocating foreign fighters. And there are unfortunately plenty of examples from history of how relocating foreign fighters have spread jihadist ideologies and how relocating foreign fighters have impacted many local struggles all over the world. For example, after the conflict in Afghanistan, the Soviet-Afghan War, a lot of the foreign fighters who went to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan, they traveled to other conflicts, including Chechnya, including Tajikistan, including Algeria, and they actually helped spread ideologies similar to that of Al-Qaeda. Some of them were connected to Al-Qaeda, and these were the agents who helped transform local struggles or local civil wars across the world. In Algeria, you see these individuals who went back and impacted further radicalization of some of the Algerian civil war fighters. In Bosnia, you see these individuals impacting the local Bosnian civil war and bringing some radical elements to the fight. In Chechnya, you have the transformation of the local ethno-nationalist conflict into a more global conflict with some similarities to global jihadist movements. So definitely these free radical relocating foreign fighters, they pose security challenges not only to their home countries of origin, and perhaps not just the countries of origin, but to the global community. And they pose a lot of security challenges in terms of spreading the ideology and recruitment possibilities. Just to conclude, because I know we have very little remaining time, individuals who might stay behind, they also pose problems. In Bosnia, foreign fighters who stayed behind and received Bosnian citizenship were implicated in building further jihadist networks. Now, all of this to say that there are certain security issues that we need to think about and we need to deal with. But to conclude, I would like to once again state that far from all returnees come back dangerous. Many come back disillusioned, and they actually cooperate with security services in trying to prevent future radicalization. But we do still have a few things to do in terms of repatriating foreign fighters and preventing further radicalization. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you. I found it really interesting to think about what you were just talking about in the sort of broader context of our first talk, and thinking about the problem in terms of how do you deal, as you're addressing, how you deal with these very specific threat of returning soldiers in the fighters in the context of perhaps not wanting to fall into this trap or this Huntington-esque view of a threat to a broader threat to civilization that the very religion itself or the very civilization itself might cause. And as you mentioned, that sort of cycle that that you're coming at this from different ends of. So I wondered if you just had any final thoughts, either of you, on how not to play into, I don't know if I'm putting this crudely, but we have the French context that you wrote about when I was reading your extended abstract, and how not to play into their view, which makes things worse, and yet still deal with these very specific issues that we cannot ignore. And that's for either of you.
Anouar, would you like to jump in?
I'm sorry, I was mute. I said I can. So my initial thoughts on this question, and I kind of alluded to this in my presentation, is to open the space for more moderate voices to also take the spotlight and not just focus exclusively or almost exclusively on the the issue of Islamist terrorism, which I'm not saying that doesn't exist. I acknowledge it's a big problem. It's a huge problem. And I am myself of Muslim background. I am myself scared about the outcome of that for Muslim countries and for their stability. And I think it's a big problem. This ideology, of violence and of like putting us all against one another. ISIS was kind of fighting the whole world, taking on the whole world, massacring and slaughtering people of all ethnic, religious, racial backgrounds. And so obviously that's something that is seriously troubling, and we need to talk about it. However, I would also like to see some focus given to moderate voices. In this paper that I'm developing for this talk, I talk about, with regard to Islamism, there is an interesting phenomena and a recent development that some scholars refer to as post-Islamism, in which even Islamist forces and the moderate Islamist political parties are now engaging in a reassessment of the Islamic heritage and the Islamic religion, and trying to engage in a very fruitful and productive way with the ideas of modernity and the ideas of democracy and human rights, etc. And I want to give an example from my home country of Morocco. I happen to be from Morocco originally. And Morocco right now, the government is led by an Islamist political party. It's the PJD, Parti de Justice et Développement. That's the French name of the party, the Justice and Development Party. And what's very interesting and fascinating is that very recently, in the last few months, this government, Islamist-led government, agreed to sign an opening of relations and a normalization of relations with Israel, which is seen as a very, very unprecedented with regard to political Islam and its engagement with the idea of modernity and with the idea of today's world. So there is clearly a movement to reassess the Islamic tradition, whether on the part of Islamist forces, but also on the part of critical Muslims themselves. There is also a phenomenon called critical Islam, and there is a huge movement that is underway to critically interrogate the Islamic tradition and bring it to the modern day. So my short answer would be, give these voices more room and give them more spotlight.
Any final comments, Dr. Pokalova?
Yeah, I would just agree with that. And unfortunately, what we hear about on the news or the social media is terrorism, because moderate movements do not quite garner the attention that terrorist attacks do. Now, from my experiences with de-radicalization programs, it seems that the very first step might be dialogue programs, and they seem to work well. And ideally, we would engage different kinds of populations with different others. However, if we think about moderates, the immediate question is, who is a moderate? And for which populations? Because clearly you don't want to disenfranchise different groups by claiming, well, these groups are moderate, but the others are not. These groups are okay for the religious environment and the others are not. So clearly suppression does not work. But on the other hand, working with different groups and trying to integrate them and trying to basically expose them to each other and their ideas, that would be a productive first step. But it's also very difficult for the government to step in. And that's where the society organizations might be more powerful, because the government does not necessarily need to be involved, especially in a secular state, saying who is who and what is allowed.
Thank you so much. And I'm sad because I would like to talk about this more and I would like to hear more and I have more questions, but I'm grateful for the time we had, and thank you everyone for attending. And hopefully we'll see you at other panels.
Thank you. Bye-bye.